Hello and welcome to Presence. I'm Doug King. Thanks for joining us on this series entitled Integral Theology. This is going to be a series that gives an overview to a new interpretation of the biblical narrative. And before anyone panics about a new interpretation of the narrative, we have to remember that the narrative has gone through thousands of iterations with regard to interpretation over the years, and it's resulted in a number of different religions and denominations and different groups because of the field of interpretation. But we're going to talk about something called integral theology. This is going to be a bit of a challenge because we're actually talking about the convergence of two different fields. And what makes that difficult is that those of you that have clicked on this video and that are watching it from an integral background perspective, and you're well versed in integral theory, you're going to see that what I'm doing is using the very basic tenets or foundation points of integral theory, of spiral dynamics, of an all-quadrant, all-level foundational viewpoint. I will not be getting into great detail as if I were going to address someone who is purely looking at this to learn more about integral theory. Nor on the other side of this am I going to be getting into tremendous detail and drilling down very deeply in terms of theology. And that's because on that side of things, we have people who are not from the integral side as familiar with the theology. And as I said, the people on the theology side, some of you that are coming to this from a theological background, but who know about, say, spiral dynamics and those kinds of integral theories, are not as versed on the integral side. So why are we doing a series like this? Well, it's because integral theology is presenting a radical departure from the history of interpretation that's led for 2,000 years to this point in time. In fact, this is a journey that we've been on for some time. And what I think most of us would realize, whether you're coming out of integral theory or whether you've been in theology, which is my background, you realize that the traditional way of seeing religion, the traditional way of seeing, especially what we will talk about in this series, the church, Christianity as a religion, is becoming more and more unworkable. And we're seeing this in the younger generations. We're seeing this in the diminishing of the traditional church. But integral theology is a radical departure from the way that that narrative has been interpreted. For 2,000 years, the biblical narrative has been used to tell the story of two world religions, Judaism and Christianity. However, an integral theology is an interpretation of the biblical narrative that says this is a story that has a trajectory that is for the purpose of showing us the evolution, step by step, the evolution of spiritual consciousness within humanity. So rather than this being the story of two religions, it is rather the story of the evolution of spiritual consciousness. And although at one time I very much had my feet firmly planted in Christianity, and it was from a very fundamental traditional viewpoint, I have, through a study over many years of my life, along with many others who may be watching now in Presence and following us at Presence, I have come to a place where I now see the narrative actually pointing us beyond religion. This is not to denigrate religion in any way, and if you're watching this and you're part of a church or you're part of any religion, I appreciate the fact that you're willing to listen to what we have to say and to consider some of the possibilities that evolution holds even more potential for us to come together as humanity on a global level beyond religion. Now, Presence, in case you're not as familiar with us as people on the theological side, has been actually studying theology for some 50 years now. And that work started with the work of Max King, who is my father. And I followed in those steps as well. That work actually started about 1965, and he began to work on some different ways of interpreting the biblical narrative with respect to eschatology. That's kind of an ugly word for a lot of people, basically because it is a much used topic by televangelists who are warning us every day that the world is going to end, that Jesus is going to come, and for some people, that only those who are the saved are going to be beamed up, caught up. They've even made movies, and you're well aware of this. So ours is a radical departure from this. So beginning in 1971, Max King published a book called The Spirit of Prophecy. And that book, the title of it, was taken from the book of Revelation, and its whole point was to say that at the beginning of the trajectory, everything that was prophesied that was going to happen in the future, which is a future that pertained to the time of Jesus, not to my future, but to the future of the people who lived in that first century, that everything was pointing to an understanding of spirituality. And that was why humanity was going to be moved from religion into spirituality itself. Now, what are some of the main tenets of this that make integral theology then so radical? Well, first of all, it absolutely does not use the assumptions that Christianity has used for the last 2,000 years with regard to the church. For us, as you'll see as you travel along with us in this series, the church had a specific time and purpose in history that was actually limited to the first century, and we'll explain that and how in the world that could be and how we could interpret the narrative to come up with that idea. But I would also note that was the same that was true of Jesus in his role or function. Jesus was only to exist at a particular time in history, then his role or function was complete. And then what we have after Jesus, what we have after the first fruit body, will show as to be where we are today in what we understand to be a new heaven and a new earth, and why that is beyond religion. So what we're going to look at in the biblical narrative is that Jesus never intended to come to form a new religion that was for the purpose of displacing Moses and the religion of Judaism. That's an interpretive lens, but we're going to use a different lens to talk about this. One other note that I would say here is there have been many within Christianity who I respect very much, and you may be one of them that are looking at this and have investigated the possibility of there being an integral Christianity. We are going to say that there is no interpretation within the biblical narrative that would lead us to integral Christianity. Instead, what we're going to say is that integral Christianity actually ends up being an oxymoron. It's like saying integral particularism. Christianity is a religion among other religions that exist throughout the world globally. So it is a particularism, and it's boundary driven. And from what we're going to talk about, we're going to go all the way back to the genesis of the narrative, move all the way through all the AQAL levels, and we're going to see that we move beyond boundary-driven thinking with regard to identity. So the proposal that the narrative is pointing humanity into trans-narrative space is going to be one of the key factors here when we look at an integral theology. Most people are attaching to their narrative. In other words, if I follow the narrative of Buddha, I call myself a Buddhist. If I follow the narrative of Lao Tzu, I call myself a Taoist. If I follow the biblical narrative, I'm going to either be of Judaism or of Christianity. And we're going to present a different way of looking at narrative in general. Now, specifically, I'm going to be always using the biblical narrative. But what applies to the biblical narrative, I also think, holds great promise for every narrative. And one of the main points of that is that rather than attaching to the narrative, the purpose of narrative is to point us to a space, if you will, that's beyond the narrative itself and that is universal in nature for all human beings. I hope to be able to clarify that a little bit more as I move along. First though, before I get too far into this, I do want to say a special thank you to the many of you who have taken time to meet with me and talk with me and study with me, both on the theological side and on the integral side. I'm most concerned about not saying anything that would be disrespectful in terms of the theological side, because I know that the subject of religion is very deeply held and it's based on convictions of people who have a sincere passion to simply do what's right in the world, who have a faith in that which they call God, and who are doing their best to honor that faith. Nor is this video or any of the videos that we produce for the purpose of trying to convert someone to moving beyond their religion. It may be that your interpretation and your life conditions find the sacredness in your tradition or your narrative to be working very well in your life. Integral theology has become, for those of us in presence and the many around the world that are studying with us, has become for us a very important and sacred journey, because we have seen that for us, the answers that are the most satisfying are the ones that lie beyond religion. But this is not to denigrate religion. So in saying thank you to the many people that have helped me, and there are many of those of you out there, I'd like to just honor a couple of people. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Kurt Johnson. He wrote the book, The Coming Interspiritual Age, and I would highly recommend this book for a great overview of the history of world religion. Then I would also like to thank Dr. Don Beck. Don Beck has been gracious enough to take time to come into our location here in Atlanta. He's sat down with Danae and with me and with our board here at Presence, and he's spent time with us. He's given me great information, and I highly recommend his book, simply entitled Spiral Dynamics, which he co-authored with the late Christopher Cowan. Don is an expert in the field of spiral dynamics, and if you really want to know it in depth, with the great depth that it has, I would encourage you to take one of his courses. Don offers courses through the year. Again, this is just an overview of integral theology, so we'll be touching on spiral dynamics, but it's not my purpose to try to teach anyone all of the many nuances of spiral dynamics. I'd also like to thank some folks I met when I lived in Colorado. I got to go up to Boulder and meet with Steve McIntosh. He was kind enough to invite me into his home, and I encourage you to look at the books that Steve has written. I started with his book simply entitled Integral Consciousness. I think that is a great overview to the many aspects of the integral side of things if you're coming from the theology side and you want to get a better understanding of some of the integral principles. And last, I would also like to thank Ken Wilbur, who was also kind enough to invite me graciously into his home and to actually spend some time with me. Those of you that are on the integral side, you know how busy Ken Wilbur is and how prolific his writings are. So that was a thrill for me, and I've had a couple of such occasions that I was able to sit down and talk with Ken. The two books, or three books actually, that really helped me understand from the integral side were the books that Ken wrote on A Theory of Everything. And I would really recommend this for those of you in theology who are just starting. Start with A Theory of Everything. He's also written Integral Spirituality. And for those of you that have a really big appetite to learn more about integral theory, he's written a very large tome called Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality. And it was, for me, a great help. So thank you to all of those of you that have helped me on my journey. What I'm trying to do now is to collate what we are doing from the integral side with what we're doing on the theological side. And again, because Presence has been doing this for some 40 or 50 years now, I want to emphasize to everyone that we come from theology, and that theology and a study of the biblical narrative is actually where our expertise lies. And I do not promote myself as an expert in integral theory. So let's take a high-level look at the trajectory of the narrative as it's interpreted by an integral theology. And remember, we're differentiating integral theology from an attempt to interpret the narrative as an integral Christianity. Integral theology is a Copernican type theory. What we're saying is that God does not revolve around Jesus, but rather it is Jesus that revolves around God, as did Moses, as did David, as did Abraham, as did Adam, and all the archetypes that are presented in the narrative. And we're going to talk a lot more about that particular point because it's key to how you see the story and the way in which you would interpret it. So let's go to my first chart, and I'll make use of this chart throughout this series, and this will be a multi-part series, even though it's an overview on integral theology, because there are so many new ideas in this. It goes against assumptions that people have typically started with, and so it's going to take a little time to nuance through all the various factors that have led us to the place where we are today. So let's start with this first chart. And in this first chart, you can see a trajectory here that says form, transform, and formlessness. Form, transform, and formlessness. That's the trajectory that we'll use in general scope, if you will, to talk about the biblical narrative. And when we do that, we will begin obviously with form, and we will show that humans, in the very beginning, metaphorical story of Adam, we're going to spend some time on Adam here in a bit, but at the very beginning of spiritual consciousness, identity, human identity, is always attached to form. That form can either be an external form, like a temple, or a city, or land, or it can be internal form. An internal form is always going to be boundary driven, and it's going to require law. And the law will be for the purpose of determining whether I violated one of those boundaries. And that's where human spiritual consciousness starts. It's not the end of spiritual consciousness, it's the beginning. And all of the aspects that we will see by using spiral dynamics will show us that these levels are all necessary, that none of them are levels that we ever leave behind, and I will explain that in more detail later. I'll use Paul's example when Paul said, I used to think as a child, but when I became an adult, I put away childish things. Paul wasn't denigrating childhood. He wasn't saying, man, I can't believe I used to be 5 years old. God, what was wrong with me? Paul wasn't denigrating childhood. As a matter of fact, everything he used as an adult was based on what he had learned at each stage of his childhood. This is not a hierarchy in the sense that we make one level or one type of learning that happened in the history of humans to be less important or less valuable than the learning that is occurring in our world today. All learning is important and necessary for a structural foundation. And that means that the value of every human and every level and every page that a human is on is a value that is based on spirituality itself, and therefore we can't honor or try to make someone better than another. So we're going to use the spiral, and when we use the spiral in this form, transform, and formlessness, the application we're going to make is that first tier is going to apply to all of the writings that begin with Adam, and then those writings move from Adam all the way through Moses and David and the prophets, and that lead up to Jesus of Nazareth. When we get to Jesus of Nazareth, the Gospels, which are his direct teachings, are going to be a description of that center transform. And the apostolic writings will be in that period as well. And then finally, we will get to formlessness. When we get to formlessness, formlessness is going to move us into the new heaven and earth, or New Jerusalem, which is the metaphorical, symbolic language that's used by John in the book of Revelation, the final revelation that was given regarding the work of Jesus of Nazareth and what his role or function was. So we'll be going through this trajectory and looking at all of these from a first tier, second tier viewpoint. So for those of you that come from spiral dynamics, that's the way we're going to look at theology, as a first tier, second tier. And what we're going to say about this is that integral Christianity is not second tier. Now, everyone has a right to disagree with that and say, yes, it can be, but we're going to give the reasons why we do not think it can be. Not to insult people in Christianity, but for the many, many thousands who have left religion, in fact, have established a whole new segment of society called the spiritual but not religious. That's a term never even existed when I was a kid growing up. I never heard of someone that was spiritual but not religious. In some cases, they just simply refer to this sector of people as the nones, N-O-N-E-S, the nones. Why is this happening? We'll talk about that. Now, in addition to that, and by the way, we will use a chart here for spiral dynamics, and let me talk about that momentarily. This chart is showing the various levels of the spiral and how they start and how they move and increase and evolve through time. And this is one of the first things that you learn in very basic spiral dynamic class, and that is that you move from the archaic, then humans moved into the tribal period, and the tribal then is that period of time when people were in separate groups and they had plenty of room between each other. But then as the globe began to populate, or people were forced by climate or other issues to go into the same territories, tribes came into conflict with each other, and that led to the warrior phase. And in the warrior phase, you have not just separate tribes anymore, but in many cases that's where the feudal kingdoms come in. And those are always warrior kingdoms. And there's a lot of violence and bloodshed and that kind of thing. And that's why it's also, as you see in the spiral, a red color. Then you move from that warrior stage, when people get tired of the violence and that way of living, into the traditional age. And in the blue traditional age, that's where you come into empire. And empire has a hierarchy that tries to protect all the people, that tries to bring all the people various means of agriculture or water supplies or whatever it is they need for the entirety of that culture. But one of the key points of that is that in a blue meme world, everyone who lives there is loyal to the empire. And because you're loyal to the empire, you do not question. That's a real big foundation of the blue meme. And that's going to apply very obviously to a blue meme type of religion, which we will discuss further. Then you see that we also move to the orange, which is modernity. Modernity is when suddenly we do start to question. And guess what happens when we start to question? Well, on the religious side, Martin Luther goes and nails his theses to the door of the church. Why? Because he has the nerve to stand up and question. And when we begin to question, we also see that there are many things in science that have been controlled by the church that we as scientists realize are just not true. And we question it, and then we separate from religion. And there are many other things that we'll talk about in modernity. That's where the Renaissance happened. That's where all of the entrepreneurial foundational things begin to happen that led to the explosion of entrepreneurial and later technological development in the world, and why that has just come about within the last handful of centuries. And then, of course, you go into the last stage of first tier, which is postmodernity. And again, all of these levels have color, and postmodern is referred to as green. And so the green level is postmodernity, and postmodernity, as we will talk about more in depth later, has its own concerns about what modernity has done. And then the final level is you move into second tier. And when you move into second tier, that's a great leap. That's a huge leap All the first tier levels, we might say, are an evolution of degree. But when we move from first tier to second tier, that's an evolution of kind. And so we'll see how that differs completely from all other level evolutions. And then finally, we're going to talk about Ken Wilber's quadrants, and we're going to take a look at these quadrants, which we have a chart on that right here. These quadrants are pointing to the totality of existence in the sense that when we look at the narrative, this is what we're doing with theology, we'll see that the upper quadrants are for individual. How does the individual affect the narrative? And we would put in the upper quadrant, we can put Adam or Moses or Jesus, and that's as individuals. Jesus of Nazareth, the individual. But in the lower quadrants, we have to look at the collective. And the collective will be called the body of Christ. Jesus of Nazareth, the individual, had role or function, but the body of Christ had role or function, and that's where we're going to reinterpret history and say that the function of both Jesus, the individual, and the body of Christ, the collective, had only a role and function of transforming what used to be a first-tier way of seeing religion, spirituality, and God into a second-tier understanding of spirituality itself. So as well as there being an individual and a collective, there is also, on the left side, the inside, which applies to the consciousness of both the individual and the collective. And there is an outside, and that's what's manifested by the individual or the collective. When we get into the collective, what we'll see is that what's manifested in the right-hand lower quadrant is what occurs on the planes of history. And this is where the biblical narrative requires some study, because when we're looking at history, there's quite a lot of history that's involved from the earlier cultures of Israel all the way through until the first century Roman Empire, where Israel is very firmly developed with a whole history structure behind it, and those structures appear in the right-hand quadrant, and they are a manifestation of what was in the minds of the collective. That's why what gets manifested in history is a result of what the collective was thinking inside. For example, the idea of Israel was that God was separate and they were always offering sacrifices and doing everything they could to remain pleasing to God. And so what did this manifest? In the lower right, their manifestation in history was they built a temple. And what was the nature of the temple? The nature of the temple was God is separate, God is in the Holy of Holies, we're over here, and what do we do to please the God that's in the Holy of Holies? We offer sacrifices, we obey commandments, and this is the way that in that society and at that level, people understood spirituality. We're going to talk about all that in a lot more depth. So let me wrap up this section with a few quick points, and then we will move into our next section with more detail on all of these levels. What I would also say is that eschatology in spiral dynamics would be illustrated by this chart. And here, what I've done is to show that you have first tier, but eschatology is in the transform that exists only in the first century. And remember that I said that the right, lower right, shows what's manifested on the planes of history. If I talk about temple, land, genealogy, priesthood, all of those things come to an end some 40 years after the cross. With the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, all of those manifested forms have been completed in their role or function. If I look at Jesus of Nazareth, his upper right manifestation was the death of a physical body on the cross and the resurrection of that body. And the purpose of that narrative story, however you interpret it, is to show that there was an outward manifestation of a greater inward spiritual reality with regard to understanding identity as a human and God. How do we relate? Is it something based on what we have to believe, interpret, or do? Or is spirituality itself the innate part of all humans? And that's where we'll be going with that. So I thank you for joining us for this series. This will end us in section 1. I'm going to move to section 2, and I hope you continue. One final note, we have an email here, info@presence.tv. As we go along, please feel free to, when you see this, send me any questions you've got. Later, I'm going to be doing some podcasts where I will attempt to answer those questions, and we'll be posting all of that on our website at presence.tv. Thanks for joining us for the series. Look forward to seeing you next time.